one of my concerns is that it's not clear to me that the intersection of art, science, and technology is a discipline in itself. And so I think part of our problem is, traditionally in an emerging field, you try and define the boundaries of the discipline and the methods and the discourse of the discipline. But I think it's the nature of the art, science, technology discussion, which is that it's a moving boundary of where the questions are, and so I'm very concerned that, for instance, that some universities are setting up, for instance, new media programs which freeze in a university structure at a given time a certain set of problems. And then 10 years from now, we'll find out that those problems are no longer the key way. And so when you say that you're in a virtual university environment, I think that is an environment that is more likely to be able to be successful at moving from one research area to another, as in fact the questions evolve. Once universities start hiring people, they freeze the question for 30 years, and so I think part of the challenge is indeed is how we work together as a community of scholars and professionals. So at the same time, you've got to work topics in depth, so you need to have a critical mass of effort to be able to work in depth. But it's not the same problem, nanoscience and art, or network theory and art, these are very different problem sets. It's clearly an accident of parentage, right? So my father had started Leonardo in 1966, 65, and he died in 1981, and I was then very involved in my astrophysics career. And at that time, our family felt that it was an important project and that it shouldn't die. And so actually we in some sense we tried to sell it. And so I went around visiting different people, explaining Leonardo and trying to find someone who might continue it. And as I visited all these people, and it was sort of interesting, that was in 1981, so I saw Ernst Gombrich and Rudolf Arnheim, and Georgi Kepes was still alive then. And I discovered a very vibrant research area, and so I just got very interested from becoming involved with that set of people. And it was sort of interesting. In 1981 was before the new media arts really developed, right? That was, things were a little bit quiet then, but there was a very lively discussion going on among those people, and they all felt that the Leonardo project was one that was very valuable to their own professional work. And so I just got more and more interested in the problem, and so I took over as the executive editor, and now help run the nonprofit organizations that keep the projects going. We're just saying before, I don't think art, science, and technology is a discipline. I hope we never see institutes of art, science, and technology with buildings, right? And so I think by the nature of the research area, it needs to be a network of experts which are not in the same geographic location. And so the timing is correct, because since we have the tools of the internet that allow us to try and set up some of these ways of working. Now, from the very beginning, the Leonardo network has had to do that because the artists involved with science and technology often were not in institutional environments. They were independent artists, or the scientists that were involved in these questions were doing it not as part of their main scientific work, but as a second activity. And so that's always been how Leonardo has functioned. In addition to people who set it up, a lot of them had been involved in UNESCO and many of these international organizations, and so they had a very strong political belief in the importance of creating links between people in different countries. And so, for instance, from the very beginning, there were for many years there was an official Chinese editor from the Chinese Academy of Arts on the board of Leonardo. There were Russian editors, and this was all during the Cold War, and so Leonardo had a very strong political position of the importance of international networking. Now, in the sciences, that is the norm. If you're a geologist or a meteorologist or a genetic engineer, you necessarily work in an international network of experts. If you're an artist, that's not all that common, right? Most artists work very strongly in a local network, but not so much in an international network of collaboration. And so UNESCO had asked us to do was to try, I thought this was a bad idea, but we did it anyway. They wanted to, from UNESCO's point of view, their public is 120 countries, right? And so they wanted to have a number of key texts up on the UNESCO website. And Philippe Keogh, who was setting up the UNESCO knowledge portals, was quite big on this idea. But I think it's the wrong model. I think we've got to have an open literature model where, in fact, this gets back to my search engine problem. If you really had a good, deep, thematic search engine as a tool that could then have, as part of its database, key references, so that when someone puts up electronic art in the search engine, then it pulls up certain key texts which are in multiple locations. Then I think that's a better model than somehow what UNESCO wanted to do. But that clearly would allow different people to identify their core texts in their own situation, and then to share those in a multiple. This would be a multiple library model. We need to do our homework and document this, because there are certainly good examples out there. One of the projects that Leonardo's working on, we're working with a computer scientist in Florida called Paul Fishwick, and we held a workshop in Germany on what he calls aesthetic computing. And so the way of defining that is, if computer art is the introduction of knowledge and techniques from computer science into art making, then aesthetic computing is the reverse. It's the introduction of ideas and techniques from art into computer science. I've argued that because the computer is not a tool, right? It's an extension of human faculties. It's a symbol manipulating device. It's a device with memory and so on. So that indeed an artist working with a computer and an engineer working with a computer or a scientist working with a computer, inevitably, certain problems can be solved by computers, certain problems cannot be solved by computers. And so if you choose to work with computers, necessarily the part of the world that you can work on is shared, right, by the artists, scientists, and engineers. And so indeed, by using the same tool, it brings with it a shared epistemology of ways of dividing up the world into things that can be handled by computers. No problem. I come from a scientific discipline, right? We cannot sell our data, so we're in a discipline where it's in our interest to make the data public, so that other scientists will use it, right? And so. If I'm funded by a space agency to build a satellite to make data, in the contract it says you will make the data available freely to the public. And so scientific data in my discipline is in an open source environment, and often the software that goes to analyze the data is made available freely. Of course, if you're working in genetic engineering, you have a tight coupling to a very specific industry, and so there's a big debate about whether genetic data is freely available to the public or whether it's proprietary to the company, and so on. So, which gets then into patent law and intellectual property questions. So, to the extent that we're working in a research community, I think we need to be working in an open source environment, because it's the harnessing of that collective collaboration that will allow us to tackle the research problems. Now, where it gets difficult then is, if you're a working artist and indeed you don't have a university salary, then the whole intellectual property question comes in again, and so there's a big debate on this, as you know. So it needs to be discussed and worked on. Mm-hmm. So I mean, the way that I defined art yesterday, which I guess Angel Kallenberg didn't agree with, was the construction of meaning and sense about ourselves and the world around us, right? And so that necessarily feeds into societal questions, and then you have to confront questions about the finality, the purpose of human life and societies and so on, and so as I said yesterday, I'm much less interested in art making that has to do with interior design rather than art making that indeed is trying to deal with problems that people face today. So necessarily you get into the interface with societal issues.